Israel-Palestine conflict, which has entered its third day and continues to intensify. Over 1,100 lives have been lost, and the Israeli media reports suggest that around 130 Israelis, including civilians and soldiers, have been taken as hostages. This crisis raises important questions about international diplomacy and India's foreign policy, and that's why we are being joined by Shubhajit. Thank you, Shubhajit, for joining us today.
Thank you, Charulata.
Shubhajit, firstly, my question to you is about this attack. Can you elaborate this attack by the militant group Hamas on Israel, and what does it really signify?
Just to put this sort of recent attack in context, on Israeli soil, Israeli territory, such an audacious attack has not happened before. So there have been wars that have been happened between Israel and its neighbors. The last one, there was one in last about 50 years ago, exactly 50 years ago, which was called the Yom Kippur War, which took place around this time when there were these holidays, Yom Kippur holidays, when Israel came under attack from Egypt and Syria. But that was two countries that sort of launched an attack during those holidays. This time, this militant group, the Palestinian militant group Hamas, which essentially controls Gaza, which is a strip of land, they mounted this audacious attack from land, air, and sea. So they essentially attacked in the southern part of Israel, and they used rocket launchers, they used machine guns, armed fighters on foot. They broke the fences, and also they used paragliders with weapons on them. People who were armed, who just launched and came into Israeli territory and attacked the Israelis. One of the most differentiating factor of this particular attack is that this time the Israeli civilians were not collateral damage. It was not as if they were attacking Israeli military officials or personnel or installations, and Israeli civilians became a collateral damage. In this time, it was a very clear-cut, targeted attack against Israeli civilians, which included women, children, and even men and unarmed men. So there was one visual of where there was a party that's going on, an open-air party in southern Israel, where you can see paragliders approaching, from the Hamas, and they're firing at these and taking these Israeli civilians hostage. These are young men and women. So they were, and as you rightly pointed out, at least 130, some accounts say 150 Israelis, including women and children, have been taken hostage. And so that's why this particular attack is being said to be one of the most audacious attacks in recent history. Possibly, some analysts have even said it is the most audacious attack since 1948, when this Jewish state was formed. And the other aspect is that complete failure of Israeli intelligence, which has its own fame, its credibility, but that has hard questions being asked in Israel about the failure of intelligence and on the part of the Israeli security agencies.
So like you said, that it was a partly failure on the part of Israeli Defense Forces and also the intelligence. Can you tell us what was the reaction immediately after the attack happened of Ministry of External Affairs? So far, we have only seen a tweet by Prime Minister Narendra Modi.
Yeah, so we have seen the Prime Minister putting out a tweet where he's essentially said that he expressed shock at the terror attacks. He called it a terror attack in Israel, and he also said that there are these are the prayers are with the innocent civilians in this kind of situation and their families. And the third thing that he mentioned was that expressed solidarity with Israel. So these are the three elements of his tweet, a short tweet that was put out on Saturday itself. But after that, there has been no formal statement from the Indian government, from the Ministry of External Affairs, and it's been 48 hours since the attacks took place, and there has been no so far there's been no till today afternoon. There's been no statement, which essentially shows that the diplomatic tight spot that India is in.
Right, right. Shubhajit, in your current piece, you have talked about India's position on Israel and Palestine, which has been on a roller coaster over the past 7 decades. Can you also elaborate for our viewers on the historical evolution of India's stance towards these two entities?
Well, this arc of India's ties with Israel and Palestine has been a complicated one over the last 7.5 decades, 75 years. But India's political attitude towards Israel was set quite early, shortly after gaining independence in 1947, when Jawaharlal Nehru and Mahatma Gandhi both vowed to support the Palestinian cause. As you know, they rejected the idea of two nations on the basis of religion. These views shaped India's foreign policy towards Palestine and its commitment towards the Palestinian cause as India became an independent nation. While they had sympathy for the Jews because of the Holocaust and what happened during the Second World War in Germany, but both these India's freedom fighters and India's tallest leaders at that point of time were of the view that any state based on religious exclusivity could not sustain on moral and political grounds. So that sort of formed their intellectual and ideological basis. That became of India's official policy because its opposition to partition of India and the two-nation theory. In fact, at that point of time, Albert Einstein, the famous scientist, he had sought for India's support in a letter to Nehru, and Nehru responded to him, and he had Albert Einstein had sought for India's support for the resolution at the UN United Nations General Assembly proposing the partition of Palestine. But Nehru refused that and said that India could not support this, and cited the reasons of national interest. But he also said that he strongly favored a federation of two states with special regime for Jerusalem for a period of 10 years, which would be followed by a referendum. Now, over the years, in the trajectory as it moved in 1950, India, however, recognized Israel. And in 1953, Israel was allowed to open a consulate in Mumbai, but there was no diplomatic presence that was granted in Delhi. But by the late 70s, early 70s, the Palestine Liberation Organization, the PLO, it emerged as the representative of the people of Palestine under Yasser Arafat, who was a young engineer then. And India developed its engagement with the largest political grouping, Palestine, Al-Fatah. Then in 75, India became the first non-Arab country to recognize PLO as the sole and legitimate representative of the Palestinian people, and allowed it to have an independent office in New Delhi, in fact, which is sort of paved the way for an official Palestinian presence in India. I mean, although India was one of the last independent non-Muslim states in 1950 to recognize Israel, it became the first non-Arab state to recognize the PLO. Then in 1980, when Indira Gandhi returned to power with a thumping majority, she continued her support to the Palestinian struggle. In fact, India at that point of time decided to give full diplomatic recognition to the office of the PLO in New Delhi and gave it all the diplomatic immunities and privileges. And, Yasser Arafat became a very frequent visitor to Delhi through the early 80s, 82, 83, when the NAM summit took place in 1983. It came up with a strong statement of solidarity with Palestine. In fact, Indira Gandhi and Arafat showcased their friendship and bonhomie. That was again in 84. Indira Gandhi visited Arafat's headquarters in Tunis at that point in time, in Tunisia, after she did a state visit to Libya. And in fact, 6 months later, when she was assassinated, Arafat attended the funeral, and the famous pictures of him weeping in public. After that, Rajiv Gandhi continued with India's approach towards Palestine. And throughout the outbreak of the Palestinian uprising in 1987, India maintained its steadfast support to Palestine. But toward the late 80s and early 90s, there were critics of India's Palestine policy, within the country. And many felt that Arab countries were not keeping their part of the bargain of the last 2 decades. So they had taken neutral position during the India-China war, and their support to Pakistan during the 75 and 71 wars did not go down well, especially with the BJP. And on the other hand, Israel helped India with arms and ammunition, 65 wars. Things sort of changed in West Asia when Iraq invaded Kuwait in 1990. The PLO lost its political leverage because of its support to Saddam Hussein, who was Iraq's leader then. And around that time, the Soviet Union collapsed. This prompted India to also make drastic changes in its foreign policy, including towards West Asia. So in January 1992, 40 years after it recognized that country, India finally established full diplomatic relations with Israel. Also, the Cold War had weakened the movement, and that sort of reduced the ideological hostility towards Israel. And BJP's emergence at that point of time as a powerful force in Indian politics in the early 1990s also removed some of these hesitations about Israel. As in the famous story goes, in January 1992, Palestinian President Yasser Arafat paid an official visit to India. And during that time, during his meeting with Prime Minister P.V. Narasimha Rao, Arafat was told that India's establishment of relationship with Israel will be helpful for the Palestinian cause. And New Delhi, he was told that can exert its influence on Israel only if it had an ambassador in Tel Aviv. Arafat came on board. And after this bilateral conversation with Narasimha Rao, Arafat, in his press conference in New Delhi, famously said, "Exchange of ambassadors and recognition of Israel are acts of sovereignty in which I cannot interfere, and I respect any choice of the Indian government." So that was sort of seen as the game changer moment, and India sort of established its diplomatic ties with Israel on January 29th, 1992. Now, over the past 2 decades, the military relationship and the political relationship actually bloomed. As I told you earlier, that India had sourced Israeli weapons during the war with China in 1962. Then, because of the diplomatic relations in 1992, the ties came in handy during the Kargil conflict in 1999. In fact, the Indian armed forces, especially the Indian Air Force, desperately needed supplies in procuring precision target bombs as Pakistani intruders were hiding in the caves and bunkers on top of mountains in Kargil. So after the political approvals, the Indian Air Force reached out to their Israeli counterparts, and Israelis didn't waste any time. They are sort of understood to have dug into their emergency stockpiles and shipped them to India, which reached the air bases within days and proved to be decisive and effective supply at that hour of need. So after that, Vajpayee government sent the foreign minister Jaswant Singh for the first bilateral visit in 2000, 8 years after the diplomatic ties were established, as well as Home Minister L.K. Advani at that point in time also visited in 2000. In fact, the BJP-led India government organized other high-profile visits also, including West Bengal Chief Minister and CPIM leader Jyoti Basu and Deputy Chairperson of Rajya Sabha Najma Heptullah, who was then part of the Congress party. They also visited at that point in time. All these were done to counter the criticism from the left as well as the minority community in India. Since then, the defense and security relationship has actually picked up, and it was evident during Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon's visit in September 2003. Between 2004 and 2014, when Congress-led UPA government was in power with Prime Minister Manmohan Singh as in charge, at that point of time, External Affairs Minister S.M. Krishna visited Israel in 2012. And sort of at that point in time, the conversation mostly revolved around cooperation on science and tech, agriculture, commerce. But areas of defense and security were avoided in public. But after Prime Minister Modi came to power, there has been much more visibility to the relationship in the defense and security sector. He met Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu in New York on the sidelines of the UNGA in September 2014. It was the first such meeting in a decade. The Israeli Defense Minister made his first visit to India to openly talk of defense cooperation. Then Prime Minister Modi visited Israel in July 2017. He was the first Indian Prime Minister to visit Israel. And he skipped the customary stop at Palestine, which was the norm with the previous ministerial visits, especially foreign ministers and others. The Modi government, however, was very careful about setting up that visit. I mean, Indian government made sure that the Prime Minister visited Saudi Arabia, Iran, Qatar, UAE, all regional rivals of Israel between 2014 and 2017, over 3 years, before Modi's visit to Israel was set up. In fact, just months before, India hosted the Palestinian president Mahmoud Abbas in Delhi in May 2017. And so Modi, in fact, later visited Palestine in 2018, in February 2018, about 6 months after he had visited Israel. But this time he again didn't visit Israel and achieved a complete de-hyphenation of the ties. So, in the last decade or so, while India initial first 50 years, it was seen to be much more aligned or lean towards Palestine. In the last 2 decades, they have moved more towards Israel because of technology, because of defense and security needs.
Okay, so that's quite a diplomatic evolution. And under Narendra Modi, like you said, it's because of the technology and other things that we have tried to strengthen relationship with Israel. Shubhajit, can you tell us, did it really impact India's diplomatic positioning and its engagement with other countries in the region, Israel, Saudi Arabia?
Well, India's relationship with Saudi Arabia and Iran and UAE and Qatar were happening on a parallel track. So India needed these countries as well for its energy imports. As you know, more than 50% of India's energy comes from the West Asian region. India has also 9 million people who live and work in West Asia. In Saudi Arabia, UAE, Bahrain, Qatar, in all these countries. and they are really
Right.
the breadwinners for their families. So India had deep stakes in these countries. With Israel, the stakes were a bit different. It was about technology, about defense, about security. So India actually moved parallelly and separately with all these countries at the same time. And it did not sort of try to do a zero sum game during
Hmm.
these years. So that's how it developed its ties. And the these countries were also possibly engaging sort of in a secretly or covertly with Israel as well. So the business was going on between these countries, except that it was not talked about in the open till in the last few years. So there was actually the all these countries were doing business with Israel. So India also went ahead and started doing business quite visibly, quite openly in the last few years.
In this current situation, Shubhajit, how do you see India's balancing act? Because it seems quite challenging, and MEA has not yet come out with any statement yet. What is your perception?
Yeah, I think because India's stakes are high in the region, so therefore India has been careful in how it sort of formulates its position. Of
Hmm.
course, terrorism will be condemned, and these attacks can't be justified. And India would obviously take a very hard stance on these terror attacks. But it would also be mindful of the sensitivities of its partners, other partners, including Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar, and Iran, how they sort of respond to this situation. Because as we know now that Israel will obviously do a counteroffensive. It has already started doing it,
Correct.
but which would be at a very different level from the
Correct.
past because of the attacks that we have seen. So this particular attack actually puts to test a couple of things that have happened in the last few years. First is the Abraham Accords, which the US mediated, and it was signed between with the UAE and Bahrain, and Israel was sort of part of it. And after that, there was an economic grouping, I2U2, which included India, Israel, UAE, and US. These four countries, which was a largely an economic grouping, and that sort of gave way almost to India's the newly launched the economic corridor, the India Middle East Europe economic corridor, which was launched during the G20 summit last month. So all these were being done at a time when US was working with Saudi Arabia and Israel to normalize the relationship to for regional security and connectivity. Now that obviously is being tested now, because India was hoping that this normalization of ties would and peace would break in, and that would be helpful for India, because in West Asia it has so much of stakes because of its people living there. It doesn't want unrest or conflict in West Asia, because its energy security is dependent for because of peace there. So, and obviously connectivity was another element that was being talked about now because of the economic corridor. So all these issues will be put to test, and India will face a significant challenge in how it maneuvers, how it negotiates, and how it charts its way out of this in this conflict. And it will find its
Hmm.
task quite tough when it comes to diplomatic tightrope walk.
Well, the Israel-Palestine conflict remains a deeply concerning situation as of now, with far-reaching implications. And we thank Shubhajit Roy for his valuable insights into this issue. Thank you so much for joining us on Indian Express.